Hello everyone, in today's video we are going to discuss the part 2 of how to play the Catalan opening or 1d4 opening. In the previous video we have discussed 5 critical diagrams on how to play the Catalan opening. So today we are going to discuss again the 5 critical diagrams, so I don't want to waste any further time, so let's start. So we have the variation number 1, or you can say variation number 6. We play 1d4, knight to f6, c4, e6, and on the third move we play g3. As we know that if we try to play knight to f3 on the third move, black can play the move b6 and basically transpose the opening into the queen's Indian. That's why we first play g3 on the third move, so that after b6, bishop to g2, black cannot really play bishop b7. So that's why we play g3, and now black plays d5, bishop g2, and on the very fourth move, black decides to capture the pawn. In the previous 5 variations, we discussed what happens after bishop e7 short castle if black goes for capturing the pawn or play something else like c6 or knight bd7. So after bishop to g2, black takes the pawn, and now we are going to play the move knight to f3, developing our knight and already focusing on short castle. Black gives the check, and now we play the move bishop to d2. Generally, we are playing knight b to d2, but in this particular position, we are going to play bishop to d2. What's the idea? Black plays a5. If black goes for capturing the bishop, we are going to capture the bishop with the knight, so that we can already capture the pawn with the knight on c4. So after bishop to d2, black here plays a5. We play a3. Bishop takes, and now we take with the knight. And now the whole idea here is, as I said, to capture the pawn with the knight. b5, protecting the pawn, like kind of the only way to protect the pawn. And now we play the move b3. Now this is a very general idea to play such position. Whenever black has fully protected the pawn on c4, it's the best way to break with b3. Definitely you are pawn down, but after black is kind of forced to capture the pawn, takes queen b3, c6 to protect the b5 pawn, and now you will realize that definitely white is a pawn down, but black is actually having many weak pawns on the queen side. White can simply castle, and now just rook f to c1, bishop b7, queen to b2, because the b2 square is very the best square for the queen, because it defends the d4 pawn and also covers the e5 square. And after knight bd7, white can play knight to e1, with the idea of basically maneuvering the knight to d3, which can either go to c5 or even to e5. So now we have knight to d5, knight to d3, queen to e7, and now white finally plays e4, knight b6, followed by e5. So what's the idea of pushing this pawn to e5? Now the idea here is, you will realize that the dark squares of d6 and c5 are extremely weak, and now we can just play knight to e4, put on knight to c5 or even to d6, and white is already the one in the driver's seat, and it is basically too much easy to play with the white pieces. So yeah, this is how you play this particular variation. So now let's move on to the 7th variation. Okay, so discussing the variation number 7, white plays 1d4, knight to f6, c4, e6, g3, d5, bishop to g2, takes, and now we play the move knight to f3 again, bishop to d7 this time. In the previous variation, we discussed bishop b4 check. Now we have bishop d7. Black's idea here is, black wants to develop this problematic bishop to c6. So now at the place of short castling first, we are going to strike in the center via knight to e5, attacking the bishop. Black have to play bishop to c6, and now we are simply going to get the bishop pair. So now we are already having the bishop pair against one bishop. Short castle, and now we have queen to d7. You cannot capture the d4 pawn, as after takes, it's a check and you lose the queen on the next move. And if you try to capture the d4 pawn with the knight, after bishop b7, black is having too many weak pawns, and white is the one having a better position. So that's why capturing the d4 pawn is kind of irrelevant. So black plays queen to d7, protecting the knight, and the idea could be to play just rook d8, putting more pressure. And now we play the move e3, protecting the pawn, rook to d8. And now black's idea is, black wants to break the center via e5, because we cannot really capture because the queen would be hanging. So first we play queen to e2, attacking the c4 pawn, e5, and finally we go for capturing the pawn. Black captures the pawn, and now at the place of capturing the pawn on d4, black can simply go for capturing the pawn, and there is no problem black is particularly facing. So at the place of recapturing the pawn, we are going to play the move queen to b5. And now what's the idea of queen to b5? The idea of queen b5 here is, we want to capture the b7 pawn, so eventually the knight is going to fall on c6. And if black goes for capturing the e3 pawn, we are pretty happy with bishop into e3, because black is already having a weak king in the center, rook e1 is coming fast, queen into b7 is hanging up, and black is already having a pretty bad position. So that's why black have to defend the b7 pawn, and now we can already play rook d1, and now black can't really capture the pawn because the queen is hanging. So a6 attacking the queen. We are simply going to fall back with the queen to c4, because black can't really play b5 now because the knight would be hanging, and at the same time putting pressure on the d4 pawn. Bishop d6, finally we recapture the pawn, short castle, and now we simply develop the knight. h6, stopping this bishop to g5 ideas, and now we finally play a3. And after a3, it looks like, how is white really going to continue the position? After a3, white's idea here is, white wants to play b4, rook a2, rook e2 is one of the idea to get the rook into the game, and finally put the bishop to b2 at a very nice diagonal. And yeah, white is already having a very good position. Because of the d4 pawn, it gives white much space in the center. At the right time, white can even go for pushing the pawn to d5. So this is one way to play this variation, a very interesting one. So this was the variation number 7. So now let's move on to the variation number 8. Okay, so discussing the variation number 8, we start with 1d4, knight to f6, c4, e6, g3, d5, bishop to g2, takes, knight to f3, a6. This time, black plays a6 with the idea of playing b5, protecting the c4 pawn. White short castle, black plays knight to c6, knight to d2, attacking the pawn on c4, because it's the usual idea to recapture the pawn with the knight, because it's the best square for the knight, and it also makes the probability of putting the knight to e5. So b5 this time for black, protecting the pawn, and finally we are going to attack these pawns via playing the move b3. Once again, the same idea. As the pawns are firmly protected, it is best to break with b3. Black captures the pawn on d4. If black captures the pawn on b3, we can already capture the pawn back with the knight into b3. And now white is pretty comfortable with via bishop f4, rook c1, putting pressure on the c5. So that's why black goes for capturing the d4 pawn. And just going back once again, after knight c6, knight to d2, you will realize that black is attacking this pawn twice. Definitely black can capture this pawn, but it is kind of, nowadays it's a mistake. It's not the best way to play, and we are going to discuss why is this natural looking move is such a mistake. So for now, b5, b3, black goes for capturing the pawn. Now we are simply going to capture the knight, takes, and now white is actually having a very strong move. It looks like a bit complex position because we are attacking the rook, black is also attacking the rook, many things are happening, but now we can just simplify the position with knight to e4. Black can't really capture the rook because of knight f6 check, maybe queen f6, bishop c6 check is coming up, followed by maybe king e7, just bishop a3 check, and the game is over. So that's why black have to trade off the queen. You can't really capture the knight because the queen would be hanging. So you have to trade off the queen. And now first we give a check, capture the queen, and now the rook is hanging, so the rook have to move. We give a check, king e7, and now bishop e3. We want to play bishop a3 check, but b4 is a bit annoying because the pawn is protected. So that's why we first play bishop e3 with the idea of bishop c5 checkmate. And white is already having a better position and much easier to play with the white pieces. So this is exactly how you play this particular position, with the same idea of like a6, short castle, knight c6, knight d2, b3, takes, and yeah, it's a very interesting variation. So this was the variation number 8. So now let's move on to the variation number 9. Okay, so discussing the variation number 9, white starts with the 1d4, knight f6, c4, e6, g3, bishop d5, bishop g2, bishop to b4 check. Now white plays knight to d2. Short castle, knight to f3, b6, short castle, bishop b7. Finally, we first play e3, asking the bishop whether he wants to capture the knight or he wants to go back. Capturing the knight doesn't make sense. You're basically giving up the bishop pair for free. I can simply recapture the bishop with the knight, so that black can't really capture the pawn because the bishop would be hanging. And now white is simply enjoying the bishop pair, and white is definitely better. So black have to go back. We capture the pawn finally. The pawn takes. If black captures the pawn with the knight, e4 is extremely strong move. If we capture with the bishop, after rook e1, there is no pawn on d5, so white is threatening to play e4 in the future, and already white is better. So that's why the only way is to capture the pawn back with the e pawn. And now we can already play b4, because this time black's usual idea is to play c5. So we stop it with b4, a5, which looks pretty interesting idea. If you capture the pawn, rook takes is good for black. So that's why we first even push the pawn further. c6, finally trying to break the position, but now queen a4. It looks like to play a4 is the best move, a very natural move. But after takes, queen e8, black is actually putting pressure on the pawn on b5. So that's why we are first playing queen a4, takes, capturing the pawn with the queen, and you will realize the b6 pawn and the d5 pawn is a bit weak now. Bishop a6, simply queen b2. Black can happily capture the pawn on e2, but after rook e1, bishop falls back, knight e5, and you will realize white is having such an easy play in this position. You can't really develop the knight from the b8 square. Like, for example, if you play knight b8, knight c6 is already a big threat, losing a piece. So it's hard for black to develop the pieces, whereas white is having a free flow of development, and black is also at the same time having lots of weaknesses. So that's why white is already having a better position. So this was the variation number 9 in the Catalan opening. So let's move on to the final variation of the day. Okay, so finally discussing the final variation, the variation number 10. We play 1d4, c4, g3, the Catalan opening, bishop b4 check, knight b to d2, sorry, knight d2 just, c5, and whenever black gives a check and we play knight d2, you can say on the next move, we can actually play a3, just asking the bishop. Takes, basically playing a bit straightforward chess. And here black captures the pawn, and now it looks like to simply capture the pawn back with the queen, knight c6, and the queen move. Yeah, nothing wrong with it, but we are having even a better way. Knight to f3. Our idea here is we want to recapture the pawn on d4 with the knight, because it's the best square for the knight to basically centralize the knight as well. Knight c6, knight takes, knight to a5, attacking the pawn and also putting slight pressure on the b3 square. We play queen to b4. What's the idea? After queen b4, first of all, we are protecting the pawn. Second, we are stopping the castling rights. And third, we are already taking some precautions against queen to b6. So a very good move. So black plays d5, striking in the center. And now we are going to actually play a bit alpha 0 move, which is a very strong move, which is e4. At the first glance, it looks like what's happening. Does this move make any sense? Yeah, it does make a lot of sense actually. Okay, after pawn push, black is having 1, 2, 3, 4 options. Okay, so if black goes for capturing the pawn on e4, we can already capture the pawn back. If you capture with the queen, knight b5 is a big threat of winning the queen, and at the same time, black is also losing a piece. If you capture with the pawn, I can simply give this bishop b5 check, and this is the whole idea of playing e4. And now you have to play bishop d7, and already f3 you will realize black is not really having a good play. If you play knight to f6, already knight to f5, a very strong move. You cannot capture the knight because the bishop is split, and now knight d6, knight g7 is game over for black. So yeah, and if you play knight to c6, simply back, I can capture, and I'm winning the rook. So this is the whole idea if you go for capturing the pawn. If you capture the pawn with the pawn, knight b5 with the same idea of knight to d6. And you can't really defend this idea, and white is already better. So knight into c4 is the move we are going to discuss. if you capture the pawn with the pawn, now bishop e3, maybe long castle, and white is having a very much aggressive play. So that's why knight into c4 is the main move. And now we capture the d5 pawn. Pawn takes. If black captures with the queen, we can already play knight to b5. And basically the whole idea here is queen to, let's say, e4 check, bishop e3, knight into e3. Now we can first give a check. Like if the king goes to the dark square, we can capture the queen with a check. If the queen goes to d7, we have bishop b5 check and the game is over. So king e8 is the only move. We can capture the pawn, give another check, and finally we can capture the queen with this takes. This position is at least good for white because white is having the open a rook. So this is one variation. But discussing the main variation, after knight c4, pawn takes, black captures with the pawn, we play knight to b5, with the idea of capturing the knight and playing the move knight to d6 on the next move. And you must remember, black can't really castle because white is already covering the f8 square. So a5 attacking the queen, we are going to play queen c5 with the same idea of not allowing black to short castle. Queen to e7 check finally. Black have to trade off the queen, and now just knight to c7 attacking the rook, and white is already having a better position because it's pretty easy. If rook b8, bishop f4, we can put further pressure on the rook. If rook to a7, white can at least play bishop to g5 with the threat of knight to d5, and yeah, white is convincingly better. So this was the variation number 10 of how to play the Catalan opening or 1d4 opening. So yeah, with this, we have discussed another 5 critical variations. If you learned anything new today from this particular video, make sure to like the video, share this video with everyone, and make sure to subscribe to our channel if you are new to our channel. Once again, Catalan opening is one of the strongest opening to play with the white pieces that definitely gives you a convincingly advantage right from the start. So yeah, so that's it for today. So yeah, I'm going to see you soon. So bye bye.